And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again. I see the next storm coming onto the picture here. Some rain spreading up to the central, maybe the eastern Aleutians late tonight. Some precipitation here in the west with a very weak system there. Otherwise, dry and light wind conditions for the central and eastern part of the state, as well as the panhandle. And then for Friday, gale force winds and rains spread into the central Aleutians and also northeastward here, reaching southwest Kodiak Island possibly late in the day. Not too bad over the interior, although cloudier conditions here across south central Alaska with some light precipitation possibly pushing into the Chugach Mountains, the Turnagain Arm, and extending down into the northern panhandle. Then for first day of the weekend, last day of September, storm system tracks just south of the Alaska Peninsula, bringing gale force winds now into the Gulf of Alaska in a narrow band, gusts of 50 miles an hour ahead of the front, and looks like gale force winds behind this system here on the back side there, with precipitation changing to more showery conditions for the eastern Aleutians. And for the coastal water forecast, pretty light winds, 10 knots along the entire coastline from the south-southwest on the south coast, central coast, south winds, and then east-southeast winds on the north coast, seas 4 to 5 feet. Light variable winds over the inside waters at 5 to 10 knots. And for Saturday, southeast winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait and Stevens Passage with 4-foot seas. Lynn Canal south at 20. And Prince of Wales Island along the coast, south winds 15 knots. Central coast, small craft advisory. Southeast 25 knot winds there, seas just under 10 feet. And then for the north coast, east winds 25 to 35 knots with 10 to 13 foot seas. Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, and the North Gulf Coast. Light variable winds for Friday at 10 knots with seas around 2 feet. Prince William Sound, southeast wind at 10 knots, seas 2 feet. And then for Saturday, big increase in the winds here. Good gales for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands out of the northeast, 35 to 40 knots. The North Gulf Coast, gale warnings as well ahead of that front. East-northeast winds, 35 knots, 8 to 10 foot seas. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories. East winds, 25 knots with 6 foot seas. Cook Inlet, small craft advisories for north winds at 25 to 30 knots with 6 to 9 foot seas. Kodiak Island for Friday, south to southwest wind, 15 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula, gale force winds here as that front comes in. This will be late in the day, so those winds increasing east 30 to 40 knots there for the western Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, for Bristol Bay, west winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. And then for Saturday, Alaska Peninsula, east-northeast winds 15 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, northeast to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. And gale force easterlies for Bristol Bay at 35 knots with 5-foot seas. And for the eastern Aleutians, Friday, east-northeast winds 35 to 45 knots. And for the central Aleutians, north winds at 40 knots with seas 10 to 12 feet there. And then winds diminish as you head west for the western Aleutians, Kiska to Shemya, north 20 to 25 knots. Then for Saturday, really laying down here for the far western Aleutians, variable 10 knots there. And for Adak and Atka, northwest at 30 knots. Gale force winds for the Fox Islands out of the north and northwest, 35 to 40 knots, strongest over toward Nikolsky. And for the southwest coast, for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, northeast winds at 10 knots, small craft advisories for the Pribilofs, northeast 25 there with 5-foot seas, light west winds at 15 for St. Matthew Island, northwest at 10 for the Yukon Delta coast and St. Lawrence Island, as well as Norton Sound. Those seas no more than 2 feet, at least forecast to be no more than 2 feet. And for Norton Sound on Saturday, east winds 15 knots, St. Lawrence Island northeast at 20, and small craft advisories for the southwest coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, 4-foot seas. Pribilof Islands, north winds 30 knots with 11-foot seas. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Friday, south to southwest winds 15 knots. Southwest winds 15 knots here for the central and western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea, west 10 to 20 knots, seas 2 feet there. And then for Saturday for the Chukchi Sea, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas. And then northwest 25 knots for the western Arctic coast, Central coast, southwest at 20 knots, 4-foot seas. Eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, southwest winds, 15 knots with 3-foot seas.